Thanks very much, everyone, for being here. I think this is, as Sylvia was just saying, such a great kind of forum for bringing together people that are working in the trenches and trying to study these things from kind of a more abstract perspective, and I think that that's just really valuable. And there's a clicker somewhere here, right? Oh, you took it with you. You can click if you want to. I'm kind of taking an opposite perspective from what you just saw today. So I'm going to talk about kind of an overview of some of the research that I've done specifically on looking at misinformation on social media, and especially how we can, how people can correct each other on misinformation on social media. So I'm going to talk about kind of 3.5 studies out of about 11 that we've done at this point. So if you have questions about any of them, that's what Q&A and Twitter are for. So social media and misinformation, I don't think I have to convince anyone in this room that this is a thing. People criticize social media for being a harbinger and a spreader of misinformation for lots of reasons that we've already talked about today, so I won't dwell on that. And you can kind of debate to the extent that this is actually a problem. So there's some newer information, academic research that shows that people are not actually sharing that much misinformation on social media. They don't see that much misinformation on social media, but they think it's a problem. So this is from a 2019 Pew study where people are saying that they're more worried about made-up news as a problem for the country, and this is in the US, compared to things like racism and terrorism, right? So people are really worried about this as a problem. And they think that it's undermining the way that our society works. So that's why we think that it's something worth caring about. Today I'm focusing specifically on health misinformation. Oh, I should also say all of this research that I'm presenting on is co-authored with my co-author, Emily Vraga at the University of Minnesota. So we focus on health misinformation for several reasons. Number one, this is a kind of classic definition of misinformation from Nyhan and Reifler. People's beliefs about factual matters are not supported by clear evidence and expert opinion. It turns out that this is hard to identify because there's not often, and it's really appropriate that we're at the National Academies today, because they do this very well, but you can only do this on certain issues, right? That there's not often clear evidence and expert opinion on lots and lots of issues. So this is from an article that we just published looking at kind of how hard it is to pin down this idea of what misinformation is. And the easiest ones to talk about are the settled issues. So at the top of the pyramid, this is where we have decades of science. It's really clear. All of scientific expertise is in consensus. We've talked a lot about consensus today. This is a really important idea in misinformation. And all of the, most people kind of understand and believe all of that evidence. Or at least agree on who the experts are, something along those lines. It turns out there aren't that many issues that fit into that lovely top part of the pyramid. An example people like to talk about is social media companies. If you search, most of them at this point, if you search for vaccines, they don't show you actual search results about vaccines. They show you consensus information, or they send you to the CDC or the HHS or the WHO. Interestingly, different platforms send you to different places, but that's a whole other conversation. And that's again the easy case, right? We can all agree with a very small minority that there is clear consensus on this issue, and this is something we can do about. Even within science and health misinformation, most of it is emerging, which is to say there's just not enough information about it yet, or it's even controversial, which is to say either the evidence is mixed, or in some cases, we can't even agree on who counts as an expert. So in the case of climate change, for instance, you often see these reports from 300 climate scientists, and then when you actually start looking at them, which the IFCN has done really well, by the way, of looking into the backgrounds of those sorts of people, when you start looking at them, it turns out that the climate scientists are oil and gas attorneys, or something like that, right? So maybe not what we would count as a climate scientist. So anyway, the point here is that health and science tends to be a little bit easier to kind of nail down what the scientific consensus is, whereas political issues are just all going to be in the bottom of the pyramid. So that's part of why we look at health and misinformation. There's also a lot of consumption of science and health news on social media. So again, looking at a Pew study, you see that about half of people, and these are Twitter and Facebook reports, say they're seeing either science and technology or health and medicine information on those platforms. In addition to seeing those kinds of information, they're also seeing misinformation. So this is from Health Feedback from 2019. They looked at the most shared health articles on Facebook in 2018, and then had experts rate how true or false they were. We won't go into the details of this, but basically red is a worse color and green is a better color. So you can see the top 10 are not looking really good in terms of veracity. And this has important public impact, right? So people make decisions about their health, about the health of their family, about the things they buy, about the things they do, about when they go to the doctor, based on the information that they get about health and science. So what you're gonna eat, whether or not you're gonna vaccinate your child, how much exercise you're gonna do, all of those sorts of things. I'm pregnant right now, I can tell you there's lots of misinformation on the internet related to all of these things. I'm pushing the wrong button. Okay. So that's the downside of social media, but what I want to give you today is maybe thinking about the ways that social media can help fix this problem, not just exacerbate it. So why might this be something that we should be interested in? We've heard a lot about echo chambers today. Echo chambers are a concern in certain areas, but it turns out that your ties on social media tend to actually be more heterogeneous than your ties in real life. So you spend most of your time in real life with people that are very, very similar to you. They have the same job as you. They live in the same neighborhood as you. They are often the same race as you. All of those sorts of things. On social media, because you have a bigger network, you tend to have a more heterogeneous network. So that means there's potential, at least for some of those people, to correct you because maybe they disagree with you. There's also what Emily and I refer to as observational correction, which is like the least sexy buzzword of all time, but we can't come up with a better word for it, which is that social media allows you to watch someone else get corrected. So this is an actual case from my Facebook feed, which I have anonymized, with someone sharing this like alleged story that Sharpie is giving away markers. This is not super nefarious misinformation, right? And someone, you can see down here at the bottom, corrects them and says, poor Snopes has actually fact-checked this story, and said, like, no, they're not actually giving away free markers, it's not true. So what I want you to emphasize here is that we don't care about this person on the top getting corrected. So maybe she updates her beliefs, or maybe she doesn't. Or maybe she actually gets really pissed off because this person corrected her. What we really care about is basically all of you. So if this is part of your network, you get to watch that person be corrected, and you get that information at the same time that you see the original misinformation. And we think that that can be really powerful in updating your beliefs. So there should be a lower threat to identity because you're not getting corrected, someone else is getting corrected. Immediacy is really important here. So one of the things we know about correcting misinformation is that the faster you can do it in relation to when someone sees the misinformation, that matters. So if you're seeing it roughly at the same time, then that's important. And there's important scalability here, right? The average Facebook user has 700 Facebook friends. So we're talking about a lot of people that might see this happen in real time. Okay, so the spoiler, in case you like stop listening or I run out of time or whatever, is that this works. And I can tell you that it works on lots of different issues. So we've tested on genetically modified food, the safety of that, the origins of the Zika virus, the safety of sunscreen, whether you should get a flu shot, whether the flu shot can give you a flu specifically, weird things about raw milk. There's weird misinformation about raw milk on the internet. Don't drink raw milk, FYI. It's a bad idea. And it also works on lots of different platforms. So we've tested this on Facebook, on simulated Facebook feeds, Twitter feeds, Instagram feeds, and a video platform that resembled YouTube but wasn't technically YouTube. So that's kind of the overview of what I'm going to tell you, and then I'll kind of give you a little bit about how we actually do this. So the first thing that we tested originally back in 2014 was whether a correction coming from a social media platform itself could be effective in updating people's misperceptions. So roughly speaking, what you're seeing here is at the top is someone sharing a misinformation story. In this case, they're saying GMOs make you sick. And then this is the Facebook related stories functionality, which has changed a lot since 2014, so it doesn't look exactly like this anymore. But basically, if you click on a link, it shows you other stories you might be interested in clicking on to increase engagement. And we said, well, what happens if you put fact-checking information in those related stories? They actually do this now for things that have been fact-checked by their third-party fact-checkers. Essentially what we found is that this is really effective. So if you get information from the platform correcting you, on the left is a control group that didn't get that correction, and on the right is the group that got the correction. This is looking only at people that initially had misperceptions on the issue, so people that were initially misinformed about the safety of genetically modified food. And you see that there's a significant effect here. In general, I'll say across all of the studies we've done, we see somewhere between like a 10 and 25% effect in terms of drops in misperceptions. So it's not that like everybody is instantly converted, but there is, you know, a substantial effect at the individual level. And again, because this scales to a large number of people, we think that that's still a meaningful effect. It's worth noting that this was the one study that we have ever done where we had an issue that didn't work, and that issue was the safety of the MMR vaccine. So that seems to be an issue for which beliefs are so ingrained that it is really difficult to move people, and I think all of the people in this room that deal with misinformation probably get that. So then this was kind of what I really wanted to study was what about other users? So platform, okay, great, but I don't have a backdoor into Facebook to just tell them what to do, let alone all the other platforms. So what about individual users? Can they correct each other, and is that effective? Or do people just say like, oh, you're some nobody on social media, I don't care what you say? So it's the same basic design here, but at the bottom, instead of the correction coming from the platform, it's coming from other users. And they are doing basically exactly what the person in Sylvia's example of qualitative interviews was saying they were doing is I look for a link and I share it and I tell them like, you know, you're not right. And this is basically what people are doing. They're saying there's scientific consensus that, you know, this isn't an issue or whatever. And they're sharing credible links, in this case, from Snopes and CDC. We varied those sources a lot in different studies, and I can talk more about that. So what we see is basically exactly the same drops. This is a slightly different scale than what you saw before, so it looks a little bit different. But basically, the algorithmic correction is what we call the platform-based correction, drops about the same amount as in the previous study, and the social correction, where you're getting correction from other users, is almost exactly the same effect as you see with the platform-based correction. A couple caveats here. If you're a single user, you actually need multiple corrections to be as effective as it coming from the platform. So if you see someone share misinformation on social media and someone corrects them, you should actually correct them again, which is kind of counterintuitive and seems kind of like a dick move. But you should do it anyway, because that actually lends more credibility to that correction. And the second thing is you have to provide a source. So we tested this with sources and without sources, just providing the link, right? They couldn't even click on the link. And just showing that you had information to back up your claim was really effective. And then finally, because I know there are a lot of institutions, health organizations in the audience, can you play a role in this as well? And not surprisingly, the answer is yes, and you're actually a very credible source. So as Sylvia was talking about in her presentation, the CDC is a high credibility health organization. 80% of Americans, according to Pew, trust the CDC, and that's actually the rare situation where it goes across party lines. So you don't see a partisan divide on that issue. So same basic setup. You can see here we're testing it on Twitter instead of Facebook, but this one we actually did on both. And the CDC is doing the correction here along with a link to themselves. Most health organizations, it's worth noting, don't do this, where they are individually engaging with people that are wrong on social media. I think they don't do that for obvious reasons. but this is, something that we think they could potentially do more of. And the same pattern exists. Again, this is a slightly different scale, so it looks a little bit different, but the CDC is helping people to update their misperceptions. A few conclusions here. So correct early, we think the MMR non-finding compared to all the wealth of other issues that we found that work is because it had a chance to really kind of get ingrained in the people that have misperceptions about that issue. All of these actors can play a role. So Pew has done some research asking people who they think is responsible for fixing the problem of misinformation. They generally say the media, which is kind of interesting and curious and a whole other topic of conversation. But our research finds that lots of people can play a role here. Health organizations can play a role, platforms can play a role, users can play a role, and they probably do better when they all are working in the same direction. So nobody gets off the hook. Providing clear sources and clear headlines is really important. If you're a health organization, providing shareable information that people can really easily find and give to other people if they are trying to engage in this corrective behavior is really important. So thinking about how do you make it findable, and how do you make it shareable, and how do you make it clear and compelling in all the ways that we've been talking about this morning. And then thinking about who you're able to reach. So a couple of things that I didn't talk about today, but some people are easier to persuade than others. People that are really ingrained on a particular misinformation topic may not be that movable, and maybe that's not worth spending a lot of time and resources on to move people that aren't movable. So that is all, but I want to take advantage of the fact that I'm in this room with lots of smart people. The things that we are interested in doing to extend this research are first, trying to do this in the field. So if any of you are an organization, a health organization that's interested in pursuing this kind of research, please talk to me. Talk to me this way. And we're also interested in figuring out how we motivate this kind of correction behavior. So how do we get people to do more of it, whether that's making things easier to find, easier to share, easier to do. So that's, if you are interested in those things, please come talk to me. Thanks.